Fallout Equestria the Chrysalis, Chapter 14, Part 2. My input was no longer required as she strode over to the door. Just as I had remembered, it had raised barely a hoof's width before stopping. Starlight got down to peer under it, then rose again, checking around the edges of the door frame. It only took a few moments to find what she was looking for. She tapped her hoof against the long panel, smiling in the darkness. A small toolkit floated from her bags, and she pulled out a socket wrench. A quick check found that the socket she was looking for, and a minute later, she had removed the long panel, setting it against the wall. Inside, the cables and thick gears that drove the door lay exposed. I was watching her poke around the inside cavity for a minute before she gave a satisfied grunt and turned back to her pack. She produced an odd, long device that I didn't recognize, sliding it into the gap under the door. She hooked a short rod on an eyelet at one end and started to crank. As the device expanded upwards, Dusty leaned in to look. "What is that?"
"Scissor jack,"
she replied, continuing to spin the crank until the top of the jack had pressed against the underside of the door. She stood again, returning to the open panel.
"Mom said that she got it at some abandoned train yard. Or was it a tank depot? Anyway, it's great for getting in small gaps and lifting big, heavy things."
"Just how many tools do you even have in those bags?"
"You've seen most of it,"
she said, and with her muzzle stuck inside the open panel, her voice echoed strangely.
"Cutter, jack, pry bar, a few basic tools like that socket wrench, a little electrician's kit, a chisel, stuff like that. Mom and I used to haul around a sledge too, but that was a bit heavy for going on my own."
"Decent kid," Dusty noted. While his tone was neutral, I couldn't help but read a hint of approval in his words.
It's a start,"
Starlight continued, working as she talked.
"I would love to get a more complete set of tools, especially if we've got a wagon to haul stuff in. I'm set for most common bolts and such, but, well, every now and then I run into something that I have to improvise with or just cut."
She suddenly stopped, ears perking up, as she drew back.
"Oh shit, I could get the hydraulic rescue tool."
It was perhaps a bit opportunistic of me, but such a clear expression of desire was one I could hardly pass up.
"What's that now?"
She grinned a little, but quickly hid it by returning to her work.
"Okay, so about a year ago, my mom and I were trading with some pony who had this portable hydraulic tool. Could pry things open like that screw jack, but could also clamp down or even cut right through solid steel. No cranking or anything. I guess rescue ponies used them to get ponies out of bad Skywagon crashes when they just couldn't muscle or magic their way out. We didn't get it because it cost more than we made in a year, but now, shit, I could actually afford that." "Huh."
I nodded.
"Guess I'll add that to the list, right after Pippa keys."
It was a relief when she actually chuckled in reply.
"Hell, you find me one of those, and you can have all the love you want."
I saw her smile fade away almost immediately, as if she finally processed what she had just said. I tried to continue on before the moment had entirely slipped away.
"I don't think that quite works that way, but thank you for the gesture."
A moment later, there was a sharp pop from inside the panel and a deeper thump as the door settled in its tracks, held up by the screwjack. Dusty had flinched back, his mouth moving halfway to his gun before he realized how silly the gesture was. "What the heck was that?"
"I just disengaged the braking mechanism,"
Starlight replied as she stepped back from the panel. Her horn lit again, grasping the handle attached to the screwjack.
"Now, all the machinery should spin freely."
She started to crank, and though it was clear it took a good amount of effort, the jack ever so slowly expanded. Just a couple of minutes later, the jack stood at full extension, having opened the gap up to almost 1 foot in height. Starlight panted softly, but was already removing her saddlebags.
"Not really sure if you'll fit, Dusty. I'll go check the rest. I'll go with you,"
I said, already removing my own saddlebags and cloak. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. She dropped to the ground and slid under the door like a slippery eel, and her magic pulled her bags through after her. I was significantly less smooth and swift with my own passage. It didn't really help that I was acutely focused on the massive steel door brushing against my chest as I squirmed under it, a subtle, tactile reminder that I only had a relatively flimsy and ancient screwjack holding back a gruesome death. Given the typical surroundings during our upbringing, the idea of claustrophobia is almost alien to most changelings, but crawling under that door felt like a moment of understanding. I was surprised just how relieved I was to rise to my hooves again. "Don't be too long," Dusty said. I can't imagine he was too happy about being left alone in the dark. It occurred to me that he had at least an emergency light source, if need be. His smoking habit had one advantageous side effect. We didn't really find that much. The rest of the facility was just as worn down and decrepit as the parts we had already seen, and the diminished numbers of our party made the silence and darkness all that more oppressive. We peeked on dormitories and offices, none of which really held anything of interest, and there was no sign of any changelings having ever been there. The whole time, Starlight just kept casting wary glances my way before turning away and pretending she hadn't. We found an evacuation map at an intersection of halls, and I paused to read it. It was heavily stained by leaking water, but it was still readable. It confirmed that we had seen all of the lab areas. The level we were on mostly were just labs, living spaces, and all the other areas ponies would commonly use. An entire section had caved in, destroying a good amount of living space, and, to Starlight's disappointment, the medical clinic. She briefly mourned the loss of untouched medical supplies and all the caps it could bring before moving on. The level below us was all utility, with a map pointing out pumps, water processing systems, air systems, and all the other mechanisms required to keep the facility operational. It was also completely flooded, almost up to the ceiling. We declined to explore any further, but after all of that, it was our last stop that proved the most significant. It was a completely incidental stop, one we almost didn't make, and we didn't expect to find anything useful in the facility's power station. We simply looked for the sake of thoroughness and one last room on the level. It was clear that something was wrong when Starlight cranked the circular handle on the ship's aisle door, only for the door to refuse to budge. She gave it a couple of firm kicks before breaking out the pry bar. It took several hard heaves before the door produced a loud metal ping. It flew open, banging against the inside wall, propelled by a sudden wind that ended as abruptly as it had just begun. My ears popped.
What the heck was that? I don't know,
Starlight said, stepping up to the door to peer in. I stepped up beside her to peer into the burnt-out ruins of the power monitoring room. As we slowly made our way into the ruined space, I felt an increasing sense of nervousness. Or so I thought. All the signs were there. My breathing was speeding up, as was my heart rate, but it just kept going. A moment later, Starlight had turned, shoving her shoulder against me. I stumbled and almost fell, and dully I noticed that my chest felt wrong. It felt really wrong, and the world felt like it was off balance, and she kept pushing, shouting something I didn't catch, but the sound of an alarm was enough to drive home that something was seriously wrong. We ran back down the hall we had come from, though my hooves felt uncoordinated. The whole world seemed to be closing in, my vision just narrowing while everything else just turned fuzzy. I don't think I could hear my own hoofsteps as I stumbled my way across the grate-covered floor, and my head started pounding at some point. I must have stumbled and fallen, though I can't remember the transition from running to being hauled up in Starlight's hooves. The world returned to normal almost as quickly as it had developed, and I found myself lying atop a desk with Starlight's hooves wrapped around me. My head still felt thick and foggy, but my senses returned as we laid there, panting.
Holy fuck,
Starlight gasped between breaths. I could feel the vibration of her words with my head resting against her chest.
I hate this underground shit.
I groaned, reaching up to rub my hooves at the sides of my head.
What was that? Bad air,
she said, switching to slower, deeper breaths.
There was a fire. Burned up the air. We couldn't breathe it.
I blinked, then groaned louder, covering my eyes. When I felt her shift beneath my head, like questioning my reaction, I spoke again.
I'm an idiot. I grew up in an underground environment. I know how important ventilation is. I should have recognized the signs of carbon dioxide built up a lot quicker.
I let my hooves fall to my sides again.
Though, I guess I've barely been back to the hive lately. Before.
We laid panting for a few moments before I added.
Thanks.
I felt her tense for one awkward moment, but to my relief, she relaxed again, dismissing it with an awkward laugh.
Well, I was running for my life in this general direction anyway, so...
It was remarkably relieving to share a simple, quiet laugh together. The fading adrenaline and lingering fuzziness in my head made for an almost euphoric moment of relief. In our entire search for the ancient facility, that moment was the most important thing we found. My relief wasn't for having survived by near asphyxiation. It felt like a moment of, well, reconnection. Where Starlight looked at me and simply didn't see chitin and holes. We gave the air a good 10 minutes to mix and even out before heading back. We were much more acutely focused on our breathing as we headed back to the power station. It was just a quick check to see if there was anything notable, though given the evidence of fire, our hopes were low. What we found was a giant shard of metal jutting down through the roof of the generator room. Though it was blackened and warped from fire, the jagged supports on one side, contrasting with the other smooth face of the others, made its origins clear. It was another part of that SPP tower that had exploded. This fragment had smashed down here, piercing through both the earth above and the metal ceiling, and destroyed the remaining generators. I had to wonder if another fragment hadn't been responsible for the collapsed section of the facility. The resulting inferno, it must have been intense. The generators looked like they had turned to wax and melted, leaving misshapen mounds of metal in their place. Catwalks had melted across the concrete supports, and the slopping floor ended in a glassy, smooth pool, as if it had been filled with water that had somehow frozen into steel. The steel covering the ceiling had drooped as it melted, leaving metallic icicles hanging like waiting blades. The remains of the tower had been fused in place, sealing the whole place airtight. We headed back. The return trip was considerably more relaxed, almost like a casual stroll through the decrepit halls. No longer distracted by focusing so much on me, Starlight took the opportunity to duck into a few rooms to grab some odds and ends. There wasn't really much: a small electronics toolkit, a couple healing potions from a Ministry of Peace first aid box, and some pony's stash of candy bars. She even tossed me one of those, and we enjoyed a little treat on the way out. Starlight slid under the door as easily as she had the first time, and once I had squirmed my way under, she held out a hoof to help me up. Dusty watched us with a faint frown. "Did you find any more?" He didn't ask what had taken so long, or about the sudden shifting of air that he would have felt, even from back there. We briefly described what little we had found before heading back. At the stairwell, I simply flew up ahead of the group, the light of Starlight's pip-buck barely reaching up there, and as I landed, I could only make out the slight silhouette of Sickle lying in the hall, her head resting against one wall and her hind hooves kicked up against the opposite. She rattled and clinked as she turned her head towards me.
Well, you fuckers sure took your sweet time. Well, we're done now,
I said, and given by her lack of reply, that seemed to be sufficient. Dusty slowly climbed up the rope, which seemed particularly awkward to me given how he had to use his mouth to get a good grip on it. Starlight, naturally, made it look easy and ascended almost as quickly as I had flown. Once they had joined us, Sickle finally sat up.
So, we all done with this stupid shit yet?
Starlight gave a quick roll of her eyes as she retrieved her rope.
Yeah, Sickle. It's all sorted out. About fucking time,
Sickle said as she stood, never really asking about what we found down there. We returned to the entrance of the facility, passing through just long enough for Starlight to break into and loot the soda machines. Then, we slept.